Hey everyone, welcome back to Deeper Roots. If you know a little bit about the Christian church, you'll know that there's different sects that are called denominations, each with their own set of traditions and core beliefs that set them apart from other denominations, all hopefully unified under the banner of Jesus Christ. For example, you have a church like ours, which is biblical first and Baptist second. You also have people who are in Calvinist churches, Pentecostal churches, etc. All these are denominations. Recently, one denomination has been taking headlines more than the rest, and that would be the fundamental denomination. We see this denomination neighbored by words like hateful, bigoted, and extremist. But how did it get this way? What is the fundamental church supposed to be, and why would churches still use the name? The question our viewer asked was, what is fundamentalism, and why do churches prescribe to this ideology? This question was submitted online, and you can submit your own question online using the form on our webpage, which is found at www.ibbvn.org/deeperroots. There, you can find more than just the form. You can find the rest of our episodes and the platforms we're streaming on. If you like this podcast, please share it with your friends, your family, and your church. That way they can enjoy it as well, and they can ask their own questions. Thank you for joining us today. Now let's get to the conversation. Today we have myself, we also have Pastor Luis, and also Esther. Today's question was submitted online, and the question is, what is fundamentalism, and why do churches prescribe to this ideology? Pastor?
All right. So, do you want the easy answer or the hard one?
Let's start with the easy one, because we will eventually get to the hard one.
Okay, well, the second part of the question is, why do churches subscribe to it? They prescribe to it because of our sinful nature within ourselves. It loves to take different forms, and it's not a new problem. Today we call it fundamentalism, but in the past we could have called it being a Pharisee, and it's always been part of humanity's condition, where it doesn't matter which part of the spectrum you're in, our sinful nature loves to take control, and the Bible teaches us to find that biblical center. So let me just go with first of all, just starting with what is fundamentalism. Let's define it. Mm-hmm. It's a relatively new term used in the last century, where it was sort of like where people were trying to say, hey, we're going to go back to the foundations of Christianity, the main principles of Christianity. So fundamentalist is that we were on the foundation, right? So we are very fundamentalist, meaning we're very biblical. Now, I am not super well versed on the beginnings of what was called the fundamental movement, but I'm pretty sure it probably started on good terms. It probably started on wanting to be zealous for the Lord and restore paths that had been lost, and wanting to go back to the foundations. I think we were talking recently about also the Reformed Church, right? Mm-hmm. For Reformed Baptists have the same idea of wanting to reform to that which is the original. So it's always sort of like a pullback. So that's probably where fundamentalism also started. But what did it become? And that's what we're sort of more aware of today. So when we call a fundamentalist church today, it's taken a very bad connotation, and it's such a bad connotation that I chose to. Sorry about that. That's a motor running right now. We are recording from my office, by the way, which faces our parking lot. So if you hear motors, we're not in the middle of a speedway or anything.
Yeah, like I mentioned last episode, we're in the church is undergoing a little bit of construction. We unfortunately do not have like an actual studio. We would love one, but it's not something that is something that we're doing at the moment. No. But yeah, we're facing the parking lot. Apologies for any of the extra noise, but Pastor.
So yeah. Continuing with the motor in the background. So basically, when it came to our church starting as an independent church, we made a decision to take out, or actually to add the word Baptist biblical Baptist church instead of fundamental. I came from a church who still uses the word fundamental in the title, which is fine, but we chose not to because of the growing negative connotation to the word fundamentalist. Although we're trying to convey the same thing which some people try to convey with the word fundamentalist, which is biblical, that we're going to make the Bible the foundation of our belief, right? That's what we're saying. So our church is
pretty much makes sense.
Yeah, New Life Bible Baptist Church, right? Bible first. And I think that's how many churches started with that name, right? But today it's taken a really bad connotation because a lot of churches who carry that name have taken it to an extreme. And that's where the word extremism comes in. And then it's been applied also to other religions, like we have fundamentalist Islamists.
Or
we
Muslims,
Muslims, right?
I'm not sure if that's a thing. I'm not 1% sure.
Yeah, Islam is a religion.
Islam.
Yeah.
Well, Islam is the name of the religion, but Muslim is what you would call people who follow Islam.
It's more like the race, yeah. Not all Muslims are. Well, I don't know. Now I'm confused.
I'm not well versed enough. So yeah.
But the thing is that it's fundamentalist. There's jihadists, fundamentalist, different kind of religions that usually now it's more akin to saying an extremist, someone who takes things to an extreme. So that's where I think fundamentalist, the word itself, has gone off the deep end. It's hard to use it in the right term today because people immediately think of someone who's gone off the deep end on a subject. And unfortunately, in the Christian realm, and what we're talking about, Bible believing churches, there is a group nowadays that do use that title, that do have gone off the deep end in their beliefs, and that's why I think it's hard to use that title today. So let's talk a little bit about that. You've heard me talk about the horse before. It doesn't matter which side of the horse you fall off of.
You're still off the horse.
You still fall off the horse. And that is biblical. Let me read you a verse. It doesn't talk about a horse, but it gives you the idea. It says, "Only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all the law, which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may prosper wherever you go." So the Bible, even when he's speaking to Joshua here, he's saying, hey, this is what I'm going to give you, but make sure you don't go to the left of it and you don't go to the right of it. Why does he say that? Because that's our human tendency.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever God gives, we want to live on the extremes. We want to push it to the extremes of what God actually said.
Mm-hmm.
So on any given issue, there's going to be two extremes that are going to be harmful and dangerous that we need to avoid. And that's why he says, hey, stick to what I give you, because that's the biblical center.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go to the left or you go to the right, you're going to be off center. You're going to be off what God actually said. So when it comes to just Christianity in general, and we talk about fundamentalist circles, we're talking about those who fall on this side, where people are very zealous about God's word, which is great, but sometimes they take and add on to God's word man's traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, because of it, as a consequence of it, because of the zealousness of not only wanting to keep God's word, but also all my preference, which now I teach as God's word, I tend to lose my love for people.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to lose grace on people. And it becomes a very legalistic system where it's all about the following rules and following this, and then you end up having to invent new rules. The last 2 Fridays, I've taught about different subjects about clothing in church, and also about music and entertainment. And I've been presenting it in that same way. The two sides of the extreme views, and then the biblical center. Because the Bible gives us biblical principles to apply. For example, this last Friday we talked about entertainment. You know, there are those Christians that would say you shouldn't watch any movies. Any kind of movie you're watching, you're belonging to the world. If you go to a theme park, you're sinning. If you're listening to any music that's not Christian, hymns or classical, then you're sinning. And then you start adding these on, and then it's like, should it be Bach? Should it be Mozart? Am I sinning if it's not one of those two? And then you can add on all these rules and things like that. But what does the Bible say? The Bible never says do not watch something for entertainment.
Yeah. So there's a I'm not sure how true the story is. Maybe you can actually confirm or deny it for me, Pastor, or Esther, maybe you might know too. But like it's like the story that I heard was that apparently the actual like the real name of God has actually been lost to history, because the Jews, like whenever they would say his name, they would die. So then the priests decided, or like the Pharisees decided, people are dying because they're saying God's name. We need to have a new name that does mean and glorify God, but not in the same, but like isn't actually his name, so people don't die. So they started calling him Adonai, I believe, and then but the real name of God had just been lost.
Yeah, you're talking about Yahweh. Yahweh is our version of his name, we're going to say, because we add the vowels to make it pronounceable. But we don't exactly know what it's supposed to be like, because yes, the Jews would not use the vowels at all. So even in the original scriptures, you won't find Yahweh, you won't find any vowels, you just find the actual consonants, because they did that on purpose in order to not mention God's name. So then exactly what it's supposed to be, we don't know. So in that sense, Adonai is just another name for God. There's many El Shaddai. There's so many different names for God. But that specific name, that the proper name of God, Yahweh, which we fill in with certain vowels, that's been lost. Yeah, but
and I want to tie that back to like what we're talking about, like. In this example, it's actually kind of necessary so people don't die, but it's it's one of those rules where like so that way we don't sin, we're going to add another rule on top of this as basically a pillow or a cushion to keep us from doing the actual sin. But then it gets taken to an extreme with like with legalism, or with like just abundance of like more rules and rules and rules. Like you can't we need to praise God in everything that we do, including our music. Okay, so that means we can't listen to any non-Christian music. Even better, we can't listen to anything that's not a pre-1900s hymn. Even better, we can't listen to anything that is not from Ron Hamilton or whatever. I don't know. Just,
and the list goes on and on. Yeah. So you just exemplified the whole point that this is not a new problem. There's an old problem, and Jesus himself dealt with it, except in those days it weren't called the fundamentalists, they were called the Pharisees. And the Pharisees, it says the Pharisees, you Pharisee, teach man's commandment as God's commandment. They would add on to God's law, making more and more rules up, like in the washing of the hands, right? God hadn't said you had to do that, and then they invented it, and then because Jesus wasn't doing it, then he wasn't righteous and he wasn't good, and you just add on and on to those kind of things. Your example about the Yahweh thing, the Bible doesn't say thou shalt not pronounce God's name. It says thou shalt not take his name in vain, which is different. So that's another example of taking the biblical teaching and taking it to an extreme, right? So they instead of just keeping themselves to not saying it in vain, they chose to instead not say it at all and take the vowels. But then that's where we talk about preferences. If that's their preference, if they had dealt it with that as a preference, and they say, it stayed that way, and they taught it that way. Hey, we prefer not to say his name at all, so we're going to take all the vowels out. Great.
It's much like how our church prefers to not drink, because like we don't have alcohol because it's it's a preference. Like obviously God says don't get drunk. That's the commandment, but like drinking in moderation isn't necessarily bad, but it can be bad because people might be more prone to drinking to get drunk than others. And considering all the history that either our members have or the history that we've seen other people have had, we decide like, hey, it might be best just not to drink, and that's what we're going to talk about as a preference. It
is a preference, it's a safer side, and that's why if you treat it as a preference, one thing, when you start teaching it as a God's commandment, that's when it becomes legalism. So going back to the question, okay, so then why do churches love to fall under that? It's because it goes back to the same reason the Pharisees like to do it. Why did the Pharisees like to do it? When Jesus talked to the Pharisee and he said, "You guys are whitewashed tombs," it's because why would someone who Jesus calls a tomb inside like to do righteous things outside? It's because it's to make themselves feel better about themselves, to make themselves look good in front of the other people. Unfortunately, it's sinful nature taking on a new form, a religious form, and it's not a new problem. So you can be controlled by your sinful nature in the world, and drinking and having sex all the time with many people, whatever. That's one form of sinfulness, but another way of sinfulness is through religiosity, and just being trying to be self-righteous and be better than other people by adding more and more rules. Look at me, I follow them, but inside you're just as corrupt.
We keep on bringing back up the show The Chosen, but I'm going to bring it up again. In the show, there's this one character, his name is Shmuel. And this is the first season. I'm not spoiling the second season or anything. In the first season, he talks about he was talking with Nicodemus, another one of the characters in the show. How it was neither Nicodemus, but like it was with other Pharisees, and they were talking about like the law is we need to obey the law, and like yes, I agree, we need to obey the law, but wouldn't it be blasphemous to say that God can't do something new? And go from that conversation to the point where Shmuel says, well, the law is God, because he believes that like everything in their law was given directly by God, when in reality, like, no, they put a lot of stuff in there, and obviously like a lot of that stuff is made to prevent people from sinning, but who's to say that people are also using that law for personal benefit? And that's something that we see a lot today too. Like a lot of the extra laws, the legalistic laws, because they are man-made, people use them for self-gain or institutional political gain. Yeah, and unfortunately, it's just as damaging as the other side of the horse. It's just, that's why he says neither to the left nor to the right, because they're both going to make you sinful before the eyes of God. Both of them are deceiving oneself, and they won't give you any fruit from what you do. That's why it says in verse 7 again, only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to the law of which I gave Moses my servant. You do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may prosper wherever you go. There's no prosperity whenever you live in legalism or you live in liberalism. So that's why, unfortunately, there are churches that like to do that. For example, I think everybody's heard of I think it's called Westboro Baptist Church. Westboro, that's it. Westboro Baptist Church. That's a very fundamentalist, but I'm talking about the legalistic type of churches. And of course, their message, they became famous against homosexuality, going up to funerals and things and events, protesting and saying God hates, and I hate to use the word, but yeah, they use the fags word, and they use it with that whole connotation of wanting to, in their sight, show God's justice and God's righteousness. But they forget that Jesus would have never spoken those words like that. He would have agreed with what is sin, but he would have not done it in hate and anger. And that's what many people on that side unfortunately display, and that's why people hate that, and it gives Jesus a bad name. Unfortunately, it gives Jesus a bad name.
And I think that's a big deal when it comes to why we see Jesus be so critical, and the moments we see Jesus in the Bible where he responds in anger towards it's the Pharisees who's he's more harsh with. And I believe, because if you think about pastors talking about, that happening in the world and the sin, but also we can sin, and becoming legalistic, we do more damage. Like, we more damage to God's name because we're professing to be believers. And when we head down this route, unfortunately, we damage his name, his reputation, sadly. And I think that's why, obviously, if you read the Bible, God was more critical and harsh to the Pharisees than the prostitute, than the tax collector, than all of that, because they were damaging his reputation.
And then in his time, that was the predominant sin or type of sin, the legalistic side, the Pharisees. There was only basically two realms. There was those who were prescribed to the religion faithfully, right? And then those were the what's it called, the Pharisees, which were the legalistic side. And then there was those that just didn't have any knowledge of the word of God, which we would call unbelievers today, right? And then, like the woman caught in adultery, he has compassion on her and forgives her. But then when we also read the New Testament, we also have to be careful, because then it does have some harsh words towards those who profess to be Christians and fall also on the other side, which is the liberal side, where it says, woe unto the man who, having tasted of righteousness, then ends up going back like a pig to the mire. He says it would have been better not to have believed than to have gone back to the things of the world. So again, it's about a balance. It's finding that balance, and let me just be clear, at our church we haven't found it yet. We're still struggling to find it, but at least we hope we can be conscious of it, that we need to find that center, and
it is a daily battle, right?
It is a daily
because
battle.
we're fighting against ourselves, right? We're fighting against our natural sinful nature.
Okay, let me ask you a question. Maybe not so much, it hasn't been an issue for you too much, but for us who've been here, do you see seeds of legalism in your heart?
In my heart?
Yeah. Of Phariseeism,
it crosses my mind, and that's why I pray to the Lord and I ask God for help.
I just confessed that to Pastor Taylor when I went over there. I said, Brother Taylor,
absolutely.
I see the seeds of not fundamentalism, but more of the legalistic. I see those in my heart, and I struggle with them.
I mean, I was talking to the college and career that we did grow up, not that it justifies our thoughts or our sinful nature, but I can speak to my old church. When I was younger, we were very legalistic sadly towards young ladies who got pregnant before they were married. They were just, the attitude towards them, it wasn't compassion, it wasn't love, not the sin, but the person. And I, looking back, I'm like, boy, we didn't do that very well. So I do have thoughts. I do have moments where I have to catch myself.
Yeah, but like everything, like I think I'm also, like, even though you gestured to me like, oh, probably not you as much, like, no, I grew up here. I kind of have that too.
You're also A-type, like me, and we like, tend to.
I'm like A-type versus B-type. Like A-type likes to take a little bit more charge than like B-type prefers to be the follower, but not necessarily like they want to get their way, but they prefer to follow people to get there. A-type, I'm gonna get my way and I'm gonna do it my way. I'm more of the A-type, like kind of like Esther. So, and considering that I've grown up in this church because like my parents took me ever since I've been a baby, it's been it's been something where I've also been trying to catch myself. Obviously, I haven't been in that mentality as long as you guys have been. That's what I meant. Yeah, but we've been in. But I've like, but also, but I have been like stewing in like the deep fryer for a while.
There's still residue.
They're still there.
And personal encounters with it. I'm sure.
What was I trying to say? But like I lost my train of thought. But yeah, I guess
you're a legalist.
I'm a legalist, but also trying to stop. And like, there's a point where like we need to not only make sure that we don't, but also apologize for when we do.
Ask the Lord right away, because I catch myself.
Like even like, but also like not just like Lord, I'm sorry, I'm not really going by your law. I'm going by mine, but also to the people that we're affecting. Because like the three of us in here were leaders in the church, pastor being the pastor and us helping out with the ministries. But like whenever like I take a legalist route when I'm trying to teach or when I'm trying to lead with the youth group, and I catch myself like I probably could be very much damaging their relationship with God, because I'm not doing a great job at being flexible, but in a godly way, right? So I have to go up to them and apologize, like, the way that I dealt with this wasn't right, but here's the real reason why I did this.
Yeah, why it's wrong, what you're doing,
Like,
whatever. But even if
here's the root of it.
Yeah.
But I'm wrong too.
Yeah, and that's the other thing too. Maybe so it's worth mentioning that is one of the characteristics when we're on the legalistic side, or the word fundamentalist churches who have fallen to the legalistic side. Not all of them have, but that tend to also not be able to say I'm sorry. They do things and then they realize that it was wrong, but they can't bring themselves to the point of saying I'm sorry and forgive and asking for forgiveness when we've erred, and that's a lesson we're still learning. We're all still learning.
One of the things that I've noticed throughout, like, both reading the Bible but also knowing our current history, is that, like, on each side of the horse, like the fundamental legalist extreme and the liberal do what you want extreme, like, it's attacking from different sides. Obviously, like, the center is where we need to be, the biblical center, I mean, but what I've seen has been, like, usually the extreme conservative, the extreme legalist, the fundamental, like the connotated fundamentalists, they have usually been in the positions of power. They've been usually the ones who have been making, like, doing the deals in the back end, right? And obviously, it's a whole lot easier to be, a whole lot harder to be in the back end now, because age of information, that's all open, or at least a lot of it is. But where we're at, middle class, back then there was no middle class, so, like, lower class, but other side of it was, like, the liberal side, like the liberal off the horse, and considering that we're in, like, that middle class, that liberal off the horse has been affecting us hard, especially in California. Just observation, but also, like, just want to note, like, there are two sides of a horse, but it's not the perfect example, just because, like, there are many different extremes in all different sides. It's kind of like there's this thing going on online, it's called the political compass, but I'm not going to quite use it. But there's, like, the extreme center. The internet calls it enlightened centrism, but, like, it's just an extreme center where it's, like, it's not the biblical center, but it's just such an extreme center that they say, like, oh, both sides are wrong, but to the point where, like, they're just, like, they're not seeing their own problems. And then there's also, like, if you look at politically, the Republican extremism and the Democrat extremism, there's also libertarian extremism. There's different parts of it that are just, like, just because you don't necessarily, like, listener, if you, or ourselves even, if we don't, like, we don't identify ourselves as, like, oh, I'm not liberal, I'm also not conservative, so I'm okay. Like, no, you have to identify you have to look at yourself where you're at. And everyone needs to always be pushing toward a biblical center. It doesn't matter where you are, whether on the political or mental or cultural spectrum.
But this comes back to the identity, right? Our identity should always be Christ.
Yeah, our identity needs to be Christ. And I think what you were describing with the compass is, like you said, there's so many different areas. But there are many different planes that we could talk about, but when it comes to the Christian one that we're talking about, there is only a left and a right. There's only a left and a right, and there's a center, and that's the biblical, because there's only two ways you can go. But in the world we live in, there's many other realms that we could talk about, the political and everything.
But it all needs to, like, go back to that center where Christ is, where
Christ
the Bible is,
where honesty lives. So like what I preached about this morning about being honest with ourselves, and then part of that verse where it says that you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free. It's not just saying, oh, I know Christ. It's about then getting to know him truly and every day spend time in his word, so you can be honest with yourself and not be deceitful about where we're at in life, and then being honest with others, and that's the hard part too. And then so I think it's definitely, like, that's your point, that as far as being in the center, that's also being in the center of truth.
And one thing I want, one more kind of note, but also we can continue talking a little bit about it. We're at the 30-minute mark, but we can continue talking a little bit longer. The idea of relapsing and bouncing back to sin. I think that, like, I personally have, like, this is a qualm that I have. Is not a problem. It's just a concern about stuff like going to a Christian school early in life, right? Obviously, it could be a huge benefit for so many kids, right? But the things that I've had like 2, maybe 3 people in my own personal life who I've seen gone to Christian school, and then they come back, and then when they come back, eventually they do fall off. They go to sin, and they don't come back to church due to their own shame, or due to whatever else. Maybe they just like what they did and they don't stop. Whatever the issue is, like, there's just, it's like when the extremes go, like, get to a point where, like, you think you're trusting in God, but then your flesh just wants you to just bounce back, even though you never even knew you could, because all your life you've just known legalism. But then eventually you relapse, quote unquote, into sin, and that just ends up just taking you away.
So what's your question?
It's more like a point rather than a question. If you want to talk a little bit about that as like one of the other consequences of legalism.
That is the consequence of legalism. That's why it says it hurts on either side, because on one side you're so afraid to be judged because of things you're struggling with. You don't want to talk about them, and then if you do talk about them, then you get judged. Or then when you end up and having to leave the church because you're just sick of the legalism and you want to go live in the world, then you get stuck in sin. Then you feel ashamed to go back because that's all you've known. The only type of Christianity you've known is legalism. So that's part of the damage that legalism does. That's akin to the damage of liberalism as well, where you just have no rule, no truth, just everything, do whatever you want, and you end up giving free license to what's it called, to sin in your life, which ends up destroying you one way or another. So that's why the biblical center is where we want to be. But unfortunately, what you would want for a person who has relapsed into sin or has had that kind of background with legalistic churches, and then they don't know, is probably have them or encourage them to seek Jesus, not necessarily a church first, but to seek Jesus, and then as he knows Jesus in the scriptures, find a church that matches that characteristic, which will be a biblical church, a church where hopefully he can find A, compassion, B, truth, truth to go along with that compassion, to guide you in the right way, and hopefully love people that will be there to help you to invest in you. So that's the thing, you need people to actually invest in people, and that's what sometimes is lacking in our churches.
Okay. Anyone have anything else to add?
No, I think if there are any doubts or questions, I would, one reason we do this podcast is for those of you, all of us, who want to ask questions. Like if you're not sure, you're having, you're thinking, maybe there's legalistic thought, whatever it may be, I think it's so important for you to be able to hopefully feel comfortable either sending a question here or talking to the leaders at your church. Use them. We're here to support you. We're here, in all seasons of life. There's times of mourning, there's time of even correction, right? And saying, oh, it's not this, it's this way, showing you through the Bible. And I think the worst thing we can do is just keep quiet. So I encourage anyone who has questions to reach out, to the Lord, to your leaders at your church, get answers, have conversations. And I think that really does help us have convictions and really live that sanctification process, and it could be a blessing to not only you who's going through it, but the person who's ministering you as well.
Okay. Thank you. And like Esther said, if you have any questions or any concerns, questions, either new questions for the podcast or any questions that you've had about any questions that you've had regarding any questions that we've already talked about, please just go ahead and ask. We would love to hear them, but also we'd love to talk about them here on the podcast. Speaking of questions that have been submitted, there were a couple of questions that were submitted back in July that we haven't answered yet. That's because we've been waiting for a great time to talk about them. But we're excited to talk about these questions. They're more about relationships, and we've been trying to get a good see if we can get some guests for those questions, so that way we can have a complete conversation with a few more voices in here as well. So we got them. We haven't forgotten about them, and we're extremely encouraged by everyone submitting their questions. We'd love to continue hearing more. But as always, I hope that you submit more questions and that you will continue honoring God. Thank you, and I will hopefully see you next week. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Deeper Roots. If you want to submit a question, follow up on something we talked about on the podcast, or you want to find us online, you can go to our webpage, which is ibbvn.org/deeperroots. Deeper Roots is a ministry of Iglesia Bíblica Baptista Vida Nueva, which is a local church in Castro Valley, California. And you can learn more about us and our church by going to our website, ibbvn.org.